Tim worked for the government for a long time, so he understands how stupid things can get in the government. Okay, so yesterday I was doing a live about this topic with 5420.01 because a lot of viewers have been sending it to me and saying, what's up with this? I was looking at an older version of it, and I'm like, well, I don't see what the big deal is. As it turns out, the new 5420.01 that was just released is 22 pages, not 7 pages, and it has significant changes. Tim, tell us about those changes.
Thanks for having me, Chuck. And I love our country like you do. And I love the fact that the Founding Fathers recognized that we, the people, must always keep our eye on a government that will go tyrannical if you don't hold them accountable. As you know, I worked in counterintelligence as a Marine, also with the Secret Service. Intelligence is a very critical thing to the national security of the United States, but it's also important for Americans to be protected against any kind of intrusion into our private information. I've had growing concerns, having worked in the community, for things that we're seeing. We're seeing FISA warrant violations. 200,000 Americans had their information viewed without proper authorization. And proper authorization under our Constitution is a Fourth Amendment protection, which is a search warrant, or in certain cases for national security, a FISA court authorization. There's always been that wall of separation. President Reagan signed into law Executive Order 12333, which basically says, hey, U.S. national intelligence resources will never be used to spy on the American people. Unfortunately, 9/11 showed us that, the agency wasn't talking to the FBI. There needed to be sharing of information with the Department of Homeland Security. They formed the National Counterterrorism Center. Information regarding terrorism, even if it crossed the bridge with U.S. involvement, was permitted. But DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, although they collect critical information in protecting our nation, they've typically been kind of out, not really included. Their information is included as needed, but again, the focus has always been protecting U.S. citizens from government intrusion. I worked at DIA for years, great organization, lots of patriots. But when this latest version came out of 5420, I noticed, as did many, that there was language that said, we're trying to protect constitutional rights, but if lives are at risk, begin working much more freer and clearer in sharing intelligence information regarding citizens. And so as I viewed that, I looked at it and said, that's concerning. Because remember, the constitutional protections are enforced through the court systems. When I reconnected with you, I wanted to let everybody know we need to watch this carefully, especially prior to the election. And by the way, you did a fantastic job with the book warning folks. I think we're in very, very dangerous times. And we need to be very aware when we start seeing subtle changes of, whoa, wait a minute, what do you mean DIA can share information with state, federal law enforcement about U.S. citizens? Talk to me about that. What's the bridge that you have to cross to make sure we don't see what we saw with the FBI and the FISA warrant, that there are abuses with virtually no light of day to it?
Yeah, I think that's the real problem, is that whatever the documents say, what it all comes down to is that somebody has to interpret those documents. And when you have people with political intent to go after their enemies, they can interpret those documents any way they see fit.
What's concerning is it says the Secretary of Defense may approve any type of requested permissible assistance. So it's not just UAVs. Back in the day, there was JTF-6. It was a combined DOD federal law enforcement effort for counter-narcotics. All the resources of the Department of Defense were available to JTF-6 based on a clear understanding, both legally and practically, as to what those assets would be used for, what kinds of information. It wasn't willy-nilly. It was also in concert with the Department of Justice in accordance with state and federal laws. So the concerning language here is, are you telling me the Defense Department now can share and it can assist federal and local law enforcement when necessary to protect lives or prevent clandestine, foreign, or terrorist organizations? Let's pause here for a second. Just think about what's been labeled a terrorist organization over the last several years.
Right.
And this support can include sharing intelligence, specialized equipment, expert personnel under controlled circumstances, with strict limitations on intelligence collection on U.S. persons, unless legally required.
How does this fit into this? Because when I was in college, I was flying helicopters for the National Guard, borrowing a CIA aircraft, doing counter-narcotic stuff in northern Wisconsin. We were using CIA assets to track them down. How is that different? How has it changed from what we were doing then to now?
The counter-narcotics mission wasn't approved all the way up, where the United States military was actively engaged with U.S. law enforcement to collect on counter-narcotics operations only. There was never authorization for the Department of Defense or the CIA or anyone else to actively collect against U.S. persons without a Fourth Amendment search warrant or a FISA warrant, which enabled U.S. intelligence collection efforts to be utilized against American citizens. Now, when you see the loosening of those restrictions, think about just who has been designated domestic terrorists within the last several years. Think about who could be at the behest of a government official with a particular party that doesn't necessarily want that entity to be successful. Americans need to be alert and aware when you see expanding language, because when you see language like confronting violence or whatever the term was, that could be anything, anywhere, at any time. The American people need to say, whoa, wait a minute. We need to get a hold of our elected officials and say, what's going on here? What does this legislation actually mean? Is there any judicial review? The courts are the last stop to protect your constitutional rights. That's why when I saw this, I wanted to make you aware, this is concerning to me. And I think Americans, in light of some of the other things you've been telling them in preparation for the election, and because, you know, you've heard this a million times, the declaration of martial law suspends all your constitutional rights. Well, that's a big thing. Obviously, all your rights are gone. But if you have steps towards those rights being infringed upon, that's where we need to be wise. We need to be alert and involved with our elected officials.
Two things that gave me pause when I was looking at this. We'll go back to the document so people can see it. Here's the document. The document that says in section C here, assistance in responding with assets with potential for lethality. Why not just say lethal assets? I started to think about drones because I was like, what could be an asset that isn't always lethal, that has a potential for lethality, but isn't always that. I remember going down to the southern border and watching the Border Patrol flying drones. They didn't need special authority because these drones don't have a potential for lethality. They can't carry a weapon, but they only had like 2 of them. If they needed more, the U.S. military has a lot of Reaper drones that can carry lethal weapons. It can carry JDAMs or Hellfire missiles. They could take those missiles off of the drones and then use them in a observation-only capacity. And so that seems to be something that would fit with assets with potential for lethality. What do you think of that?
That's a good analysis. It's important we remember the U.S. military has been effectively for, really the last 20 years fighting insurgency connected to intelligence collection. So there are a lot of resources, some we can talk about, some we can't. The DOD could bring drone technology, aircraft technology in the counter-narcotics fight. One of the concerning things with our current state, Chuck, is we have a number of very dangerous people are crossing or have crossed into the U.S. When you begin to think of what's behind the effort, DOD and government agencies are very good at not writing what makes it clear, but writing things like instruments that are potentially lethal. That could be a lot of different things. And again, my purpose is not to go crazy. It's just to say to the American people, if we don't guard our liberties and our constitutional rights, we're at risk of losing them. And that's why we raise the alarm. The military is strictly prohibited from using force against American citizens under posse comitatus. They cannot cross the bridge. I'm a federal use of force instructor. Those are federal guidelines as well. The overarching case for any law enforcement officer using force in the U.S. is Graham versus Connor. It's a Supreme Court case, which basically says what that document does. Must be reasonable, must be objectively reasonable. You must have facts to support it. The point to that document is use of force. The point to 5220 is collecting information.
So there's the differences. That's what's changed.
That's what's changed and changing. And again, it should horrify Americans. And I'm not saying this is happening. I'm saying that you and I are exercising our First Amendment rights to have a conversation about it. If the national intelligence community is now actively, without court oversight, spying on Americans. Oh, by the way, that's not conspiracy theory, because that's exactly what happened with the FBI FISA infringements. Yeah. Those are the warning signs we should look for, because all of that activity within DOD, those are definitely arrests, the use of force, but that's not against Americans. DOD should never be using force against Americans as long as posse comitatus is still law, and it is. And who should be? Federal agents, state and local law enforcement. Why? Because there's a structure in place that if they go off the reservation, there are criminal and civil lawsuit provisions, Bivens, and other statutes under 1982 USC where you can sue, hold these folks accountable. My concern is when troops roll out, who are they rolling out against? Why are they rolling out against them? Who designated them? Because quite frankly, I'm not sure I would trust any cabinet secretary to make those decisions. I would trust a court, but not necessarily a cabinet secretary. These are legitimate questions every American should be asking.
So posse comitatus can only be made exception to by Congress, right? They're the only ones that can do that.
That's correct. I think the president can for a limited period under martial law, where you suspend posse comitatus. The military is being used to arrest citizens absent some kind of war, then we're in no man's land again. This country, it is interesting that martial law was suspended during the Civil War, or was exercised, and all Americans' rights for a period of years were not enforced.
I was just reading the history of the mine wars in West Virginia back in the early 20th century. There was a lot of infringement on people's, not just constitutional rights, but natural human rights, in that a lot of labor laws that we have today are a direct result of those infringements and trying to fix that. Somebody's asking in the chat, how does it work between the states if the federal government, they cannot impose this kind of collection on the states? From what I could tell reading that document, it has to be asked for by local or state law enforcement and then granted by the DOD. Or am I wrong on that?
The language is confusing, to be honest. I think from the language written in this directive, it's DOD's authorized, when approved by the Secretary of Defense, to share information. The challenge is, if that's national intelligence information, then you're crossing the bridge again, which is why the National Counterterrorism Center was set up, so the CIA and the FBI could share information. To the point, if any state official feels rights are being infringed upon, an example being hot topic, Second Amendment, you've had many in sheriff's associations across the country come out and say, if there's federal law banning Second Amendment provisions, we're going to support and defend the Constitution and not necessarily take those actions. We refuse to do it. Now, the question is just for conversation, but what if that particular group deemed domestic violent extremist group, I'm not saying anything your audience hasn't heard, arrest warrants against Catholic priests and those kinds of things. Those are the warning signs that all of us should go, we've got to be careful. How do we do that? We contact our elected officials, exercise our votes, and stand strong for the principles of the Constitution. That's the rub with me when I begin to see if there's violence, we can do this. If we designate a group. That's all fine as long as there's judicial review and true accountability in the process.